Hello, my name is Sixten and welcome to my Stell guide. In this video I will walk through her main build archetypes as well as how I like to play her early game. Stell is a super fun hero that incentivizes pivoting and being flexible. So, flying as a concept is what ties together Stell's item kit. So we can put her builds into different categories. So first up we have the airborne builds. These are builds that care about having flying items on the board, and so long as they're flying, you're happy. So for example, an item that gains power the more flying items or weapons you have. What matters in an airborne build is just to take off once. You don't need to have repeat flying, and an example of an airborne payoff item is Skyliner, and this archetype is one of the easiest Stell builds to get going, since all you need to solve is just the flying part. Next we have fly cycling, which might be her most flexible and common build, and these are builds where you utilize fly cycling. Now what that means is that you still want to be flying as much as possible, but your items benefit from the flying being repeated. So for example, there are items that say whenever an item starts flying, haste it. So if you want to have a lot of haste, then it would be beneficial to repeat fly. An example of a support item for this archetype is Free Fall Simulator. Now in the early game, I usually refer to these kind of builds as start-stop. Then we have its sibling Stop Cycling, which are builds that care about stopping. So they have items that explicitly benefit from stopping items, which means that you only want to make items fly, so you can immediately stop them from flying. And a payoff for this archetype is Hang Glider. Hang Glider is an item that makes all other items on your board fly, so that item on its own solves the flying part for you, and then it deals damage whenever you stop flying. So that means that the rest of your board could just be dedicated to stopping the items from flying. Stop Cycling is my personal favorite Stell archetype. As of right now, it doesn't have nearly as much support as the others, but it is extremely fun and unique. Then we have Stop, which is the builds that just want a targeted stop effect. As Stell has quite a few items that want to be stopped, and when they stop they usually, for example, get destroyed. An example of such an item would be Bon Voyage, which when it stops flying uses itself 6 seconds before it destroys itself. So in such a build you don't care about cycling the stop, you just want to have a quick stop as soon as possible. So it plays quite differently from the stop cycling variant. Then we have flight proc builds, which are builds that care about having flying items that are very fast. So an example of a payoff would be Space Laser, which gets charged whenever you use another flying item. So here, kind of similar to Airborne, you just care about making as many items as possible fly, but then you also want those items to be as fast as possible. So it's a different puzzle to solve. Another example of a flight proc payoff is Vortex Cannon, which gains damage whenever you use a flying item. Then we have the flightless Stell builds, which are just the builds that don't really utilize flying all that much. An example would be the Molten Ball Blaster tool build. The downside of these builds is that they don't have as much overlap with the rest of her items, but it is very fun to also be able to play that kind of stuff on Stell. And then we have the Haze Fly hybrid builds, and these, the reason they're called hybrid is because the way Stell generates haste is usually through flying, but these are builds with payoffs that explicitly benefit from haste procs. So Stellar Swallowtail is an example of this, which gets charged whenever another item gains haste. We also have Pill Buggy, which scales its shield whenever it gains haste. But both of these builds are utilizing fly cycling to generate the haste, and that is why I like to call it a hybrid build. And then we also have her slow builds, which are just about generating as many slow procs as possible. And the two payoff items for this are Steam Hose and Lightning Rod. And this build archetype doesn't have as much overlap with the flying stuff either, but since these builds often slow your own board, they do actually benefit a bit more from flying than the tool-based builds. Now these are far from the only builds that Stell have. These are just the ones that I find to be the most iconic ones, and then maybe in a future video I will go more in depth into other variants or her self-destroys package, but this should give you a good idea of where most Stell builds fall into. Alright, now let's talk about day 1 on Stell. So when I play Stell, there are usually 4 different early game builds I tend to go for, and those are Molten Ball Blaster with tools. It's Kara, ideally with an aerial turret. It's Balloon Engine, oftentimes paired with a freefall simulator. And finally, it's Chicken Cannon, often paired with a security drone. Now, it is a bit difficult to rank these, since it's not just about raw power day one, it is also about how expensive they are to play, how easy it is to pivot away from them, etc, etc. But out of these four, my top two would be the Molten Ball Blaster tool line, as well as the Balloon Engine line. And it really just boils down to which items you see first, as something that is crucial on Stell is to balance your economy well. So first up, we have early game build number 1, we have Tool Stell, and your payoff item here is Molten Ball Blaster. So if you find a Molten Ball Blaster in your first shop, for example, I would always recommend buying it, and then you're gonna start looking for small tools. So Ayla is very attractive. She can give you the upgrade on the Ball Blaster, as well as Angler, Drone, and Box Cutter, which are also tools. Stell also has a fairly small bronze medium pool, so especially on this line, I love going Lost Crate for random medium, where you can either get Toolbox, which is a very important item to build economy, but especially in this build it also provides you with tools, or to give you the Molten Ball Blaster upgrade. Andy is amazing because you want to play small tools, and a lot of Stell's small early games items are tools. And why this is such an attractive early game option is because Stell has a level up option that gives you gold per tools you have. So when you play this line, you will often find yourself a lot richer in the mid game than with other lines. And that makes chocolate very affordable, which means I also gain a health advantage here because I can safely buy gold chocolate day 3 or 4. Now the major con with going with this line is that there isn't much overlap with their flying builds here, but your improved economy, I find, mitigates that downside. So here you see an image of what a day 2 tool board can look like. So here we have our Ball Blaster, which I've managed to get to silver. We have a joystick, which is a tool, and a couple other tools. And then here on the level up, we got the Side Hustle, which now gives me 12 gold. In my stash, I have a toolbox. So you can see how already on day 2, choosing to go with this line gave me a distinct gold advantage. And here you see, a day later, me being able to comfortably afford gold chocolate here. I have a full board, and I will have 7 gold left over after I made this purchase. This is a very comfortable early game line, but it requires a bit of finesse. I utilize free nodes a lot because there are, for example, a node that says that you can get a random tool. If you go to Jungle Ruins on Stell, you can get a small silver tool from any hero. So while this line might not be as strong as, for example, the Balloon Engine in terms of raw damage, I find it very consistent and reliable, which I value highly. Early game build number 2 is the aforementioned Balloon Engine. This one pairs very nicely with Freefall Simulator, so this is usually the early game build that lands you in this start-stop archetype, where you want to start flying as often as possible. Now, if I find a Balloon Engine, I want to make sure I find my Freefall Simulator to keep chaining burn, and then I also want small burn items, like a blowtorch or a firebomb. Kite is another consideration here. Cinders are very powerful free nodes. And then going to Andy, you're looking for the small burn items, as well as items that fly or make stuff fly. On this line, I also like clicking Lost Crate for random mediums, as there are a lot of good hits here, either an upgrade on the engine or the simulator. Now, the major con of this line is that it's very easy to overcommit to it. This line doesn't have as great of an economy game as the tool line, so you have to be a bit more careful. And it can be very tempting to just keep pumping cash into making your burn number bigger and bigger. Now the issue with that is that the more you have invested into this build, the harder it can be to justify pivoting out of it. Because I don't believe this to be a build that necessarily holds up in the late game. So you have to be careful just to make sure you have enough gold on day 6 that you can comfortably pivot out of it if need be. But this is a very consistent line as well. And in the Stell mirror, Balloon Engine should be able to outrace the Ball Blaster. So in terms of raw power level, I do believe that this is her strongest early game build for PvP fights. Early game build number 3, we have Aerial Turret. Now, I call this Aerial Turret, but really it is the Kara based weapon lines. But the way I like to play it is that I get my Karakara, I get my aerial turret, and then I want to find headset. I want to find a headset to haste my aerial turret. I want to find a joystick to charge it. I want to find a gyro to buff it with damage. And then I want to find an angler drone to give me more redundancy. So aerial turret is an item that whenever it goes off, it decreases its own cooldown, which means that it eventually reaches 1 second. And while it is flying, it has multicast. The way you have to play this is that you want to go all in on the aerial turret. It can be very tempting to try and just play a bunch of weapons, but I find that the most consistent way to win is to simply go all in on the aerial turret. So an example of that would be to place your Karakara on the far left or far right of the board to ensure that the first time it goes off, it is guaranteed to give your turret flying. And when you're playing aerial turret carry, gold chocolate is invaluable because it takes time for your turret to really get going, so you're weak against aggro. Now, the major cons of this build is that it's both very expensive and it's also vulnerable, and it's also very vulnerable to aggro. This build I do find weaker than the other two, but if I see a turret or a Karakara on my first node, in my first job, I will for sure buy it, because I also find it very fun to play. Finally, we have the Chicken Cannon line. Now, Chicken Cannon is sort of like Stell's Armored Core. Now, of the 4 builds I have talked about, this one I believe to be the weakest, because it loses to poison as well as burn. But if you find it early, you can absolutely go for it. And so what you want to be looking for if you have a Chicken Cannon is, once you reach level 2, you want to find right-handed or left-handed, or strength. Just anything to buff the base damage on your cannon is very powerful. And the best shield target to buff is the security drone. Now the security drone wants to be flying, so for that reason you often also want to find some small flying items. And then Karakara is also useful here, since it can both make your drone fly, as well as potentially also buff the damage of your cannon if you can manage to make the cannon itself fly. Now small shield items like aviators also work here, but this is a build I try to pivot away from as soon as possible. And the archetype you often land yourself in when you do that is Stop Start, since a lot of Stell's shield items have synergy with the flying. Now that covers the early game, which brings me to day 6, which is the big day. This is the day when you're able to start seeing gold items in shops. And the way Stell has been designed is that a lot of her strongest payoffs are gold large items. This makes it crucial to have at least 24 gold saved up by day 6. And here you have a lot of options, so I'm just gonna name a few. I have a few examples here. You have Skyliner, Dagger Wing, Space Laser, Lightning Rod, Stellar Swallowtail, and Pill Buggy. Now I will make a future video that is a bit more in-depth about her late game lines, but for now it's just good to know that, but just be mindful of trying to make sure you have 24 gold by day 6. Now some of these lines are way easier to pivot into than others. For example, Skyliner requires very little setup if you're already playing a flying based build, whereas Lightning Rod not only requires you to have a bunch of slow items, which most Stell builds don't, you also need to solve scaling on it somehow, which is usually only achievable through skills. I hope this guide was useful. I hope to make more Stell content in the future. I already have a video planned for tomorrow, which will be my top 10 favorite Stell items. Thank you so much for watching.